Welcome to the February session of the Practices Research Seminar Series. Today we have got the topic of social fiction as a means of unflattening disabled children's educational childhoods. We have got with us Dr. Jill Pluquailec, Senior Lecturer in Autism at the Sheffield Institute of Education, Sheffield Hallam University in the UK. And I must say that and I have met Jill at the Creative Research Methods Conference, which I do keep mentioning in this seminar series, but unfortunately her session was clashing with my own, so I couldn't attend it. So I basically just thought, oh, this is a good opportunity. Let's get her to present it here, and then I get to see that as well. So Jill is teaching and research is concerned with social justice for disabled children and families, with a particular interest in the ways bodies and spaces in education are both produced and reproduced within the matrices of power and surveillance. Her work sits within the critical disability studies, disabled children's childhood studies, and critical autism studies. And I can see some people who are from that space in the room already, so this will be quite interesting for you. And her work centres on destabilising the dominant knowledges in relation to what it means to be and to be understood as marginalised. Jill has a specific commitment to social justice and ethics for groups that have been historically excluded or oppressed in both research, design and practice. And I guess that's where the social fiction work comes in as well. In my own work, that is the reason why I am using social fiction. So we've got plenty of things to share. But I won't be doing that now. I'm going to just stop sharing my screen and I will hand over to you, Jill. And I look forward to having the conversation with you later.
Lovely. Right. Is everything where it should be? Can you see everything you need?
Yes, absolutely. All here.
Right. So just to start, I'm from the world of disability studies where we script our presentations, and sometimes when you come into other spaces people are like, why is she reading a script? But that's because that's my home. So this paper presents a methodological reflection on the use of social fictions as a means of unflattening disabled children's educational childhoods. I argue there's a critical need for new ways of exploring the lived experiences of neurodivergent and disabled children in educational research as a means of complicating the flat understandings that deny the embodied, affective, socio-spatially mediated experiences of school life. So today I'm talking about a book, a short story that I wrote called If Walls Could Talk. It's a fictional short story set in a primary school. It was written as a result of several years' work across a number of different projects, which included fieldwork in a primary school, a study of autistic children's and families' experiences of education during COVID, the Right to Review project, which explored parents' views of the UK SEND reforms in public consultation process, and a critical discourse analysis of the Green Paper associated with those SEND reforms, as well as my regular learning in my work as a lecturer on postgraduate courses across the subjects of autism, disability studies and education. So while most of these projects had distinct aims, data and outputs, the cumulative learning has led me to regularly question how best to write about the everyday affective mundanities of being known as disabled and most frequently neurodivergent child in the educational system in England. I've long sensed that I needed to do something more or something different to attend to the questions and affective experience of researching within the field of disabled children's education. My late night worries, fieldwork daydreams, analytic frustrations and gut feelings amounted to more than just a matter of writing style or genre of research outputs. They were acts in the process of reconceptualizing for myself what is possible to do and to know in research, and as such were matters of both ontology and epistemology. And as a result, both this short story and the paper that I'm talking about today conceive of writing as inquiry following Richardson and social fiction as the methodology of that inquiry. So in this paper, I'm using methodology not to imply that social fiction is a tool for data collection or analysis, but to signal its role as a generative mode of inquiry and knowledge production. This distinction is important. For me, social fiction, as I conceptualize it here, is not the product of coding data into narrative form, but rather a way of inhibiting theoretical and empirical tensions through story. So the intention of If Walls Could Talk is to bring to life the visceral and affective atmosphere of being within a primary education in contemporary times. It's written from the perspectives of the school's walls, the walls of the classrooms and corridors, in order to position the institution and the curriculum laid bare on those walls at the centre of the story. In much literature, the lived experience of being a child, a neurodivergent child, a disabled child, a child with SEND, in a school and in a classroom, is commonly narrated as an individual experience. These narratives tend to be dominated by an interest in social and cognitive functions, achievements and attainments, outcomes and life chances. If Walls Could Talk instead reminds us that the imagined individual child is one of many within an institution, with a specific place and a specific space of its own histories, communities, and mundanities. The material of these mundanities is perhaps exemplified by the walls, and their carefully crafted displays of curriculum and achievement, which enable and constrain particular ways of being or becoming known within those walls. So why is this needed? There's a rich tradition of using the arts to engage in thinking with and about disability. This tradition is tightly woven with disability arts and activism, too numerous to attempt to do justice here. Instead, I quietly reference Karen Sheeder, who we can see in this slide, and her song that was called No Place Like Home. Some of the lyrics are here. And the archival work of On Whose Shoulders, to acknowledge the ongoing urgency of calling new worlds into view for disabled children and adults alike. The methodological genre which this paper sits within is social fictions, first coined by Levy. This tradition is explicitly an arts-based research method rather than a vehicle for representing otherwise qualitative data or for translating research findings into an accessible or literary form. Here, fiction puts its own partiality at centre stage, and I'm drawing on Gilman and Tipper in their quote. Declaring that one's work is fiction is a different rhetorical move than declaring one's work is social science. And that actually, sorry, I've got misquoted there. That's come from Watson in 2011. Such a move orientates the reader as well as the writer. And then to go back to Watson, quote, providing a set of expectations that carries with it certain responsibility on the part of the author, end quote. When the work is both social science and fiction, it disturbs what Watson describes as the pact between author and audience. This matters in educational research and research about disability and the SEND policy landscape where evidence or evidence-based practice often reigns supreme, while simultaneously failing to fully account for disabled children's experiences beyond deficit discourse. As Banks notes, quote, facts don't always tell the truth, or a truth worth worrying about. The emotional texture of experience is often what interests me. The consequences of the facts in the lives of actual persons, end quote. So challenging the very notion of, quote, evidence as somehow factual, fiction disrupts dominant knowledge claims in helpful ways. So I'm going to focus on two areas or two kind of techniques that I use in this social fiction work. And the first is to think about voice narration and representation in stories of disabled childhood. I do this to attend to the particular context that disability and childhood bring, with their particular ethics and risks, to the range of techniques that social fiction authors have offered us thus far. So following Saunders' advice, it was crucial to ensure that every detail I included in the story, whether actions or inactions, served a purpose. Each one needed to matter. And drawing on Barone and Eisner, these techniques are not merely ornamental, but are vital elements that serve a heuristic purpose in this research approach. So the first one. Though the story is about school children, the decision not to write from the perspective of children, nor with a child narrator, was deliberate and centred on the ethics and epistemology of representation and voice in research and in broader society. Both disabled people and children have had their voices marginalised in a society that deems itself able to speak on their behalf. There's a long history of activism and resistance to this silencing in the disabled people's movement, encapsulated in the long-held mantra, "Nothing about us without us." Children's voices have been considered irrelevant in matters of their own lives, such as education, due to the dominance of developmentalist logic, which holds that childhood is simply a stage of immaturity towards an eventual adult position of competency and authority. Given the multiple disadvantaged social positions that disabled children find themselves in, it is vital to work to counter such blockades to self-representation. With that in mind, it would have been unethical to develop a story which claimed, or even feigned, to speak on behalf of disabled children. If I'd chosen to represent my hand as author as that of a child or children, I would have been in ethically murky water, and a water that I do not wish to swim. Authors of fiction may have fewer qualms about narrating children's voices, such as their craft, but the additional weight of responsibility on authors of social fiction, as I've already outlined, is pertinent to this decision. The epistemological issue of writing from the perspective of a child would have been in the individualising of experience. This would jar with my argument that schools are socio-spatial encounters, where certain bodies are afforded less space than others to be known. To narrate any single child or even adult's perspective would have run against the underlying principle that school experiences are deeply socio-spatial in character. I've previously grappled with issues of authorship and voice in research about disabled children, including in my own PhD, and so I've often chosen to write autoethnographically, to keep firm boundaries between my authorship as the person at the keyboard and the representation I offer to any life lived, in recognition of the inherent power imbalance between the two. Here, I've chosen not to narrate my own positionality in the form of a discrete autobiographical account. This isn't an omission, but a methodological and political decision that aligns with the broader concerns of this paper. To pin down the process of reflexivity to fixed identity categories risks repeating the very logics that this work seeks to unsettle. As Pillow, now quite a while ago, argued, reflexivity can easily become a performance of transparency that serves the researcher more than the research. Similarly, Mazzy and Jackson critique the expectation that voice, including the researcher's own, should be coherent and locatable. In this work, my presence is diffused through the narrative technique, framing and form, rather than the expression through personal exposition. To provide particular legibility would to be assumed that identity is stable, that reflexivity is singular, and that the researcher, and perhaps the reader, can be fully known. I take a different position, informed by a post-qualitative and feminist scholarship, where reflexivity is partial, situated, and necessarily unfinished. My voice is in the story and in the argument, but is not pinned to a fixed authorial self. Choosing the walls as the narrator in this story is at once both serious and playful. As the wall narrates in the prologue of the story, and this is a quote from the book, "There's little I don't do or don't know. There's little that goes unseen by my many faces in many places, simultaneously everywhere and overlooked. Some might call me subversive simply because I go largely under the radar, day in, day out, yet I'm everywhere, steadfast, day in, day out, long before the first bell rings and long after the last." End quote. The walls were the perfect narrator of both the space and temporality of children and adults in school. With policies enacted on its surfaces, the walls are an enduring presence and witness to the long passage of time through short and chaotic school days. Narrating as the walls removes the inherent risk of feigning the voice of a child, because the wall is not imbued with the requirement to be known in particular ways, as neurodivergent, as having SEND, or as a child. It also blurred the boundaries of the notion of protagonist, which in any story of disability runs what Jung describes as inspiration porn. Instead, without a human narrator, the story allowed for multiple perspectives to be brought into view at any one time, none of which were the typical protagonists or characters one might expect of an everyday school story. By choosing a narrator that was neither adult nor child, researcher nor teacher, I sought to destabilise the potential hierarchies that might be typical in educational research and school-based writing. Social fiction, and the particular decision to narrate through the walls, is one way to attune to the affective and sensorial registers of school life. The fizzy joy and fuzzy pain, the hunger, weary small frames of bodies at the end of a long school year, the playing fields of scorched grass, and the lava-like tarmac of a playground in a heatwave. These fragments of the sensorium are neither aesthetic flourishes nor incidental. They are the very matter of neurodivergent life navigated in school, matter that is often flattened or absent in educational discourse. Fiction offers us a means of tracing a pulse through bodies, spaces, and relations. Nevertheless, designating an inanimate object as narrator of the lives and bodies of disabled children is not without its risks. One of the central features of the walls' personification is their deep sense of empathy with the children in the story. The walls feel the intensity of living in the children's bodies, in the fibre of their being. They attend to the many fleeting and often missed moments of children's experiences, moments which might seem inconsequential but have cumulative effects. Levy and De Freitas urge us to think as authors long and hard about who is heard and who is silent in the stories that we tell. Nowhere is this more relevant than a story of disability in childhood, given their historic social positions of disadvantage. I'm acutely aware of the danger of implicitly and explicitly drawing parallels between the emotional worlds of an inanimate object and the neurodivergent children. Potentially, this device perpetuates a historical discourse of said children that dehumanises them and narrates their emotionality as non-human or in some ways deviant. And I'm drawing on the work of Botha there and the work they did with that, where you can find out more about the grand narrative that dehumanises neurodivergent perspective. Oh, sorry, that's my email in the background. How am I doing for time?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, you're doing fine. You've got another sort of 5-10 minutes.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, I'm absolutely fine then. I just didn't notice what time we'd start. Sorry.
That's fine.
I'm also mindful of my contribution to the swathe of research that stories oppression is the singularly defining feature of a particular community, drawing on Tuck. This perhaps is one of the reasons I felt compelled to avoid naming diagnostic categories or peddling tired tropes about stereotypical representations of particular behaviours. Traditional qualitative research, which relies on the words of participants, often reproduces the flattening of neurodivergent children into their diagnoses, positioning them as knowable primarily through behavioural markers, intervention targets, or deficit logics. In contrast, this work aligns with neurodiversity-informed scholarship that resists the demand for legibility, drawing on Yergu there. Through the social fictional deployment of the walls, it was possible to reject much of the shorthand that qualitative research participants rely on to make themselves comprehensible, and that then the researcher then relies on to make their findings legible. I wanted the walls to be able to offer multiple ways of seeing, knowing, and understanding bodies, and potentially doing so in ways unnoticed or ignored. I held tightly to Gordon's notion of what they called complex personhood, in which one respects the presumption that people's lives are simultaneously straightforward and full of enormously subtle meaning, end quote. Steeping the story in effective language offered by literary practice to capture the senses and the body, even a body that is a wall, was one way to bring richer dimensionality to the characters of the story, be it the purple flesh of a teacher's face or the crumpled frame of a small panicking child. The other feature I want to talk about is the use of social fictions to tell stories that are always multiple. One of the greatest affordances of social fictions is the ability to pull at multiple threads at once, which is one of the devices I consider so valuable in the unflattening of disabled children's bodies in school spaces. It could be argued that If Walls Could Talk, the short story, is not, in fact, about disability, nor a story of disability. It does not actually make explicit reference to disability, impairment, or diagnosis. Disability is invoked in my telling you that it is invoked. Within the book itself, there's a one-page exegesis at the end. In the countering to the flattening of disabled childhoods as collections of symptoms or behaviours, the story holds multiple social issues at once. It is at once a story of disability, but also of poverty and hunger, the climate crisis, current curricular initiatives, and school funding gaps, all of which are pressing social issues in contemporary UK education. Just going to close my emails. It's driving me mad. The story becomes a world-making conversation between author, reader, and society. As Watson explains, I love this quote. The sociologist novelist creates the subjects and worlds, and the reader interlocutor uncovers the research knowledge within it through the active process of reading and sense-making. The reader becomes more than just a consumer as they sift through the story, and if they see themselves inside it, tie their own personal issues and troubles to the characters' troubles, as well as to the wider social issues of the novel, and in doing so are effectively cultivating a sociological imagination. End quote. Part of that cultivating is a sense of place, which I would argue is essential in thinking about disabled children's educational childhoods. In the sense of place I hope to invoke in the story, the pace of that story is important. Schools are busy, frantic, and often confusing and contradictory places. Each one is a microcosm, an ecosystem, with their own cultures and practices, rituals and rhythms. Yet there is something deeply familiar in a thick description of school spaces, and I'm thinking of Sykes' work there about creating sense of place in schools. And literary techniques of pace proved useful to develop that thickness. The sense of place in this story sought to mimic the lack of coherence and overwhelming chaos many children experience in education. The narrative arc needed to splinter and to fracture, to resonate with the embodied intensity of the children's movements through such a chaotic yet highly regulated space, day in, day out. As the walls remind us, in the school, as in life, everything is always happening all at once. And this is a quote from in the book. There's rarely a moment of nothingness in this place, always something to do, to fix, to break, to negotiate, and to care for, end quote. For those of us that are interested in more nuanced understandings of the everyday lives of neurodivergent children, the capturing of this intensity in a fictional space and inviting readers into that space, be they teachers, school staff, parents, or the general public, is a vital literary tool in complexifying both being and becoming known in the world. And I think I will finish there.
Thank you very, very much, Jill. This is a fantastic presentation. I knew I was going to like it. So thank you so much. It's been great to have been able to listen to you. And there's obviously a good round of applause, but virtual only, but still it's fabulous. I'm going to kick off the conversation, but please, anyone who's on the call, please do make yourself known to me if you've got a question or a comment as well. And if you can't unmute yourself, then please put the question in the chat, and I will be reading the question out to you. So my question, Jill, to kind of begin that conversation is really, you're very, very clear about the social fiction being a generative mode of inquiry of knowledge, and I'm quoting you here, and that social fiction is not data collection and it's not analysis. And I wonder, are you able to separate these things out in that way that you're saying it's not data collection, it's not analysis, it is a generative mode of inquiry? And if you are able to separate this out in your own mind, in your own way of working, how do you do that? Because I'm asking that because a lot of people that are working in this space of practice as research, they are doing that kind of inquiry way of working, but at the same time, it is an analytical form of thinking, so it's difficult to separate it from the analysis. Maybe it's easier to do that, to separate it from the data collection, but from the analysis it's kind of a little bit difficult. So I'm trying to kind of find a way of how we have to understand that.
Do I have a way to separate them out? No. No, I think that this is so the thing that made this kind of come to fruition eventually was a period of ethnographic field work in a school. Like I've said, it's kind of lots of things over lots of years, but this particular time that I spent in a school over a period of months, I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know what to do with it. And one of the things that I found most difficult to do any analysis and or writing about was how tricky it had been to build and form relationships in the school, and particularly thinking about some of the adult relationships.
Yes.
Or kind of the permissions to spaces I'd been given with those adults, whether I got to know them or not, i.e. some teachers whose classrooms I just sat in the background of, but never really got to know, kind of thing. And how to deal with what I'd experienced in some of the more problematic experiences. So what, basically, it was kind of years of ruminating on how can I talk about the really dodgy stuff that goes on.
Yeah.
If that's about real people that did real things.
Yeah.
And that's not to suggest that I've just gone, well, they are actually real, but I'm just calling them fictional. It's not that. But that for me, there's a real ethical dilemma in being able to do justice to the injustices that disabled kids experience in schools, whilst doing that through adult relationships where I've certainly I have experienced witnessing practice where I've thought, that's a bad person doing a bad thing. But I've also witnessed practice where you're like, I'm fairly convinced that's a good person thinking they're doing the right thing there, but the consequences of it are really bad.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with all of that in the most traditional forms of kind of data collection and analysis?
Yes. And I understand that. I mean, I've had some really difficult conversations as part of my own research where, if you analyze it in the traditional conventional way, you're identifying exactly who said what, and that's problematic as well. So I totally get where you're coming from. It was just, for me, it was interesting to kind of think about like how you sort of making sense of it in your own mind. Is this a generative mode of inquiry, or is it an analytical way of thinking, making sense, and sharing that analytical thinking in a way?
I think it becomes both quite quickly, but as in each time that I've kind of convinced myself that there is a separating out.
Yeah.
I think I end up back with the Laurel Richardson, writing is the inquiry, writing as the inquiry, that the only way to do the analytical work is to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think with Laura Richardson, because of how they present the work there I forgot the name now, who the other person is that's just done a lot of work around that in that space as well. What they tend to do is they tend to say that the fiction writing is the making sense of it. But within practice research, we still have a very specific research question. Whereas I'm assuming, but again, this may be a wrong assumption, so correct me, but I'm assuming that when you were writing, you weren't literally focusing on a specific research question, you weren't trying to answer a research question. So maybe that's the difference between the social fiction pieces for sociological imagination purposes, as opposed to something that's a social fiction that's as practice as research.
Yeah, and I wonder if it's that there was something cute. There's something cumulative about this story, that it's from lots of different parts of doing research over years, which will have all had kind of their own distinct questions to be answered, and that actually it was for me a way of pulling together lots of different kind of thematic work over the years. Rather than I'm not convinced that I'm somebody that would be be defined by the act of the fiction as my practice. Because I don't think that I would be producing this work if, for example, you picked me up and put me, I can't think of places that I don't know something about. I don't know. Put me in a police station. Would I be producing short story social fiction there? Maybe, but I don't think it would be as sociologically informed, because
you're not as immersed in the space
as well.
You have to be kind of immersed in the space, I guess. So there is a question there. Somebody who has asked me and you know, to kind of read this out to you. Just in question about the choice of the walls as a narrator. I was struck by the link between that perspective and Bell Hook's exploration of her experience of being situated on the margins. It is to be part of the whole, but outside the main body. I wonder how your experience of using this voice enabled you to access to a perspective that is perhaps not as individualized, singular and simple, that can come from a view from the center. Great question.
Yeah. And quite like, that's a hard question, isn't it? It's a hard question. The walls thing, again, it was this like over time. How do I do this stuff? What is this stuff? And there was definitely something to me about not being able to diffuse the fact that this comes from observing at the edges of something, like quite often, literally at the edges of classrooms. As a researcher and as a person in the space physically, there was something to me about it needing to not be human. That felt really important, because I think there's so much of kind of educational discourse, and particularly discourse around education, disability in education, that is so human-centric, so centered on individual capacity and individual minds, which just completely neglects the materiality of being inside these schools. Like this, I write the story, I set it in the middle of a heat wave, because the field work that I was doing at the time that this was coming back to all the time was during that 40-degree heat wave, and the kids were in porta cabins. That kind of like, there was no way that isn't a defining feature of school life at a certain point if you're in a 40-degree heat porta cabin. So the walls thing kind of it pulled away some of the risks of humanness and some of the seriousness of humanness and the dodgy things about representation. But when I was kind of trying to develop it as a character, I actually sat and watched videos of the character Forky from Toy Story. I got really interested in how inanimate objects have life in storytelling. So kind of that kind of new materialism, post-humanism kind of way of thinking about materials, but also in the storytelling of like giving life to inanimate objects. And so I don't know why, but each time I was like, that is just a really great inanimate object full of life, right? Sorry, that was a total ramble.
No, that's great. Well, that's great though, because it does respond to that question about, you know, the wall as a narrator, but also you said about, you know, the kind of the experience of the heat wave in the classroom, and anyone who's ever been a teacher in a classroom can empathize. But I think equally important is the day where it snows.
Yeah, like, but again, we strip all of that out, don't we? Of like anything to do with being research perspectives, when actually any kid, adult, teacher that spent time in schools knows how much of a difference a windy day makes, a snowy day makes. Like, this period of just heat. It shaped everything that went on in that school term when I was there, because it was dictating everything that couldn't happen, right?
Yeah.
And so it's that kind of stuff that I want to bring into the conversation about childhood and disability, right? Because it just doesn't exist, or it's so far at the edges that it's considered no longer research, right?
Absolutely. Can I bring in Beth Pickard, please? Beth, are you happy to unmute yourself? There we go.
Hello. Hi. Yeah, I just want to say thank you for the presentation and how much it resonated. I was just in a school this morning as part of our research project, and just can really empathize with what you was like, navigating the dynamics and the realities and wanting to articulate things, but without sort of naming, or just the complexity of that, really, and also the importance of, like you said, like nuance and context, and how that can be lost when we're refining down in research. So I just really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you. It's really kind.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's something about fiction that can just do more things than data analysis and field notes and all of that than it can, because it can just hold more at once, right?
I wonder if there's a parallel as well, like the research I'm involved with is about music, and like we delivered the first music session with the pupils today, and prior to that there was so much like anxiety and resistance and fear and unknown, and as a musician myself, like I had so much faith in the richness of the music and what that would bring. So there's something about creativity and modalities as well that can kind of shift and just change the narrative as well.
Yeah, you've made me remember another motivator in this, is that, so I've always used certain kinds of storytelling in my work, and I would sometimes take some of those storytelling bits into teaching. Most of my teaching at that point was on Masters in Autism, and the bits that people wanted to talk about afterwards, and the bits that got the conversations going, and the bits that people had the penny drop moments with stuff that was stories, because suddenly you could be talking about something, you could be talking about all kinds of things, but people are less intimidated when it's a story than when it's research. And so who is it? This is a paper that's due to be published, which has got more in it. But maybe it's a Levy quote about what something being fictional and or a story does for the audience and the reader itself, is that like fiction is a leisure it's a pastime, isn't it? So it's not intimidating. So people kind of people feel they've got permission to read a story or to understand a story or to interpret a story, compared to if I think about how all this stuff about like how you get research into teaching practice. Well, we know that sounds really intimidating for some teachers to end up, to be asked to engage in research, but ask them to read a piece of fiction, and then suddenly everybody's kind of got a bit more permission to it, because it's a creative act then, isn't it? It's not a knowledge challenge.
Thank you very much, Jill. Chris, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Actually, the last thing that you said was really interesting to me, because in my experience, it was exactly the opposite, in the sense that when I use narrative storytelling in my teaching, both students, or if not necessarily all the students, but most of the students kind of go around it, because it's safer to engage with the scientific stuff rather than storytelling.
What do you teach?
I come from philosophy, so I do ethics specifically. And one of the things, what I was wondering about is to what extent that can be also culturally dependent, because I'm stationed in Germany, and that is a different crowd, I should say. So yeah, I was wondering what your take was on that. And then I had another question about specifically because I come from ethics, and you have a commitment to ethics and social justice and all that stuff. Is how, like, what kinds of normative frameworks do you use? Do you actually use research on that, or where does that come from? Specifically, I was thinking when you were talking in the beginning, I was thinking about the epistemic injustice discourse, for example, epistemic violence, stuff like that, and I was wondering what your take was on, or what your
Oh, it's interesting because I'm about to, my next teaching this afternoon is MA autism students, teaching them about epistemic injustice. So that's using Robert Chapman's work. So that's where that's in my head very much as kind of pedagogical rather than anything. I think it is potentially super culturally specific. I think there's a chance also that the MA autism that I teach on often feels like quite a different space from other things that I teach on or have taught on in the past. So a lot of our students come from, even though they're doing a master's, don't necessarily come from kind of strong academic backgrounds. Some come without first degrees onto that course. So we spend a lot of the course is about people finding their place in academic life because they feel very much as if they are imposters into it. So I wonder if there's something about that stuff working there because of the context of, like, people. So there's been people on that course who've come from being a dentist in practice and then come and done that course, which is, it's a course that's technically situated in the social sciences. So they come and go like, I can't do this stuff because I'm a dentist, right? Or I can't do it's such a kind of hodgepodge of where people enter that course that maybe that's some of the stuff that works. Where I'm kind of quite interested in this story and going with it is with teachers. So I technically sit in a department that is also has a teacher trains new teachers arm to it. And they're like, the cultures of their engagement in academic work are quite different, even though we're all technically in a Department of Education, right? And I think that that's quite interesting. And we often see quite a big divide between those that consider them, including in academia, those that consider themselves practitioners. I'm either a teacher or a person that teaches teachers, and those that consider themselves kind of researchers and research active. So I think there's all sorts of stuff. One of the things that I've actually done with the book is send a copy out to each of the primary schools in this city with like no instructions other than, can you go and put this on your coffee table in the staff room?
Thank you, Jill. So just to add to that, Chris, I think, like from the German-speaking countries, me being from Austria, I think there is a different kind of way of how we read literature, and a lot of our students and a lot of us are sort of thinking of literary theories and having to be very sort of engaged and theoretical about, like analysing literature as well. Whereas I think in the UK context, having worked here for quite a long time now, I think there is a different approach to that, and I think that's probably also underpinning the readiness for people to probably accept fiction and reading fiction in a sort of more critical way, but not actually being as daunted by it as the people in German-speaking countries. So I think there is something there about the culture specificity as well. Jill, you've kind of said already, one of the questions I did have was about reading it to the people or sharing it with the parents and the schools, and you did say that you asked them to put it on the coffee tables. Did you get any feedback? Did you hear anything back?
Yeah, so UK kind of context higher education where everything has to have something that's has impact of that's got very specific rules
impact
about
or knowledge transfer.
Yeah, like all of that. And I'd spoken to the impact people in our university, expecting them to go on, you need to do this and you need to do that, and you need to find out what they did with it and how they changed their practice. But I was like, that would spoil it all. That takes away all of the magic. And by the end of that meeting, given that it's their job to say otherwise, they were actually like, you're right, you mustn't try and find out. You mustn't track this impact. You must just leave it be, which I thought was fascinating that I'd completely persuaded them away from the impact agenda. But, so I did, I very much did. Like, my email address is technically on the letter that I sent, and they could technically look up my name, but no requirement beyond that. I quite quickly had one of the primary schools in Sheffield get in touch with me saying, could we have some more copies of this? Because in the book I said, this is free. If you want more free copies, you can have more free copies. So could we have more copies of this? And I said, oh yeah, how many do you want? And he said, and it was the head teacher said, can we have one for every member of staff? Because we'd like to use it to centre our inset day. So the first day back of school in September, the teacher training day to start the new academic year is like, I want them to sit and read this, every member of staff to sit and read this book in the morning. And I was like, aha. And then my question was like, oh, why? And he said, oh, because like, I want us to have a shift in our relational practice in school. And I think this is it. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, the way that it's taken up. Make something almost like agendaless.
Yeah.
To see how that head teacher, something happened to that head teacher when he'd opened that book that had gone, there, that's what I get from this, and that's what I want other people to take from it. So yeah, on individual levels, I've had conversations with people, but that's the one that did a thing, an unprompted thing.
That's quite exciting, though.
It could be, couldn't it? Yeah.
Can I just ask in terms of practicalities? I mean, obviously this is self-published, but it does have an ISBN number, and I do know that some people here are working in this kind of space, so they may be interested in how did you go about that then?
Yeah, and I suppose that was part of some of the dilemma of what this was going to be and how it was going to exist, and why it was many years in the making. Was at first it was like, oh, where could I publish something like this? And I don't know is still the answer. I don't know anywhere that I could have published it that wouldn't have detracted from it being what I wanted it to be. Because it was silly things like certain publishers, you couldn't publish something that short.
No.
Or if you publish with them, like I've got a proper academic monograph and it has to have a really boring generic stock cover.
Yeah.
And for me, the aesthetics of this feeling like a piece of fiction on a particular kind of paper and things like that, those little details really mattered. And so eventually came to the decision like, well, I'm just going to have to, the university gave me some money to do it myself. And so then part of that was the university said that they would pay, what is it, the £150 or something fee to have the ISBN as well. So the university were willing to do that. I don't know whether they knew what they were agreeing to do, but the decision makers that said that I could pay the money to get it printed and things like that were up for it, were convinced.
Brilliant. It's exciting. I mean, I think it's a great project, and like you said, I mean, it's connecting with people in different ways, and I think that's what we really want to sort of focus on. Just to say to anyone in the room, I did actually put the link in the chat box, so if you want to access Jill's book, the link is there.
Thank you.
I'm gonna just like very quickly highlight the Theatre of the Oppressed in Place-Based Research, Reflections and Provocations from an Artist Researcher by Olivia Mora, which is going to happen on the 26th of March. So if you're interested in that, please do join me again. I'll put the link to the registration form and the registration detail on in the chat box. And I'm also, again, sharing some other links, the Buzzsprout, the YouTube channel, and the information that you will need to kind of stay in touch with the Practice as Research Network. Again, Jill, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate that. It was great listening to you, and there are so many questions and comments and that I still have. So I do hope that there will be an opportunity for us to sit down over a coffee or something and hash out some more of those details.